There was almost nobody who was busier than Winston Churchill during World War II. He was a very busy guy, and yet he actively took time to reflect. This is a man who stamped "Action this day" stickers on key orders. He was a man of action, and yet he deliberately took time to reflect. And so I think whoever you are, you're not under more stress than Winston Churchill in World War II. And if he can take time to stop and reflect, then you can as well.
John, what's new with you, my friend?
Hi, Scott. Well, the team is doing a lot of work on research in the mindset economy, and that includes a piece of really interesting research that we're doing at UCL, looking at long-term future implications of leadership. And when we think, maybe 2 decades ahead and working back, what are the promising young leaders of the future going to have to do differently in order to be leaders credible enough to cope in that future? So we're doing that. We're also doing a series of investigations into AI and robotics and other technologies in the global healthcare system, and we'll be releasing those in the autumn. And I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm writing another book. So,
Wow. You've got a lot going on. How do you approach a research project like that has a sort of that future back methodology that you mentioned?
Well, we're bringing together a lot of very diverse voices and expertise, neuroscience, robotics and AI specialists, geopolitics, economics, all sorts of different people to help us kind of understand how the world is changing and how it might develop. But it's not a futurology project. What it's really trying to do is understand, the human condition, because that never really changes, under different types of pressures and strains that are likely to develop, and therefore what are leaders going to have to do differently than they might do today, and how will you start to develop yourself as a young leader in that environment. So I'm fascinated to explore that, and using the future back methodology that we've used so effectively in other applications kind of opens up a different perspective onto the assumptions of today.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to see what you discover, and I'm sure our listeners will be keen to know too. Well, friends, welcome back to the Mindset Economy. We've got a great episode to share with you today. We recently spoke with Dr. Nicholas Wright, a neuroscientist and advisor to the Pentagon and UK government, whose work sits at the intersection of the brain, technology, and security. He's a researcher at UCL, Georgetown University, and the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and I was just captivated by this conversation.
Yeah, it's a really rich exploration on everything from how the brain operates under stress to the implications of that playing out in geopolitics and AI. So let's get into it and hear from Dr. Nicholas Wright.
So Dr. Wright, welcome to the show. In 2017, you wrote a paper for the Pentagon with the argument that in modern conflict, the goal has shifted from destroying your adversary's capacity to fight to influencing how they think. You don't defeat them, you change their model of the situation. You call this the gray zone conflict. And I'd love for you to unpack this for us, particularly from a perspective of what you see happening inside of organizations where competition has shifted a bit from sort of resources to mental models and decision making.
Yeah, well, of course, thank you so much for having me on. I mean, it's a great question. So that report, you're absolutely right, that came in 2017, but actually that was the first sort of public report. But we've been working on that really since 2014, since what happened in Crimea, right? Because things changed. And now what you had was Russia that was willing to put little green men, as they were, but they were Russian troops, pretending not to be Russian troops. They were putting them into Crimea. And they were also starting to, it was obvious they were conducting, quite serious information operations in Western countries. They were doing all sorts of things. And what we realized is that in the Pentagon was that things were changing, right? We were no longer in the US unipolar moment. We were now facing serious adversaries who were highly capable. It wasn't like even someone, Osama bin Laden or whatever. You could potentially kill terrorists. You could lock terrorists up. You could prevent terrorists from doing things. But you can't prevent Russia from doing things because Russia has an enormous nuclear arsenal. And so the centerpiece became thinking about human minds, right? How do you, when you can't physically prevent somebody from doing something, how can you influence them, right? And so the question then became, how can we influence them if they're thinking about doing something like Crimea, if they're thinking about doing something like information operations in Western countries, if they're thinking about doing something like launching a nuclear weapon, right? Because that's what you have to think about when you're thinking about Russia, as we've seen in the last, more recently in 2022. Mm-hmm. And so the centerpiece of all of that is the human brain. And what we realized as well was that so many people just didn't really have a very realistic view of how brains worked, right? The dominant set of ideas were all really quite inadequate in many ways. Right? And by that, what I mean is, you had people like Steven Pinker, who, got his big book coming out saying, don't worry, guys, the world is tending towards peace, humans are rational and all the rest of it. And that just wasn't really how the world worked. And so what we needed to do was start applying some science to thinking about how we can influence other people and how we can protect ourselves from their influence. And that's what this work was all about. Now, how does that relate to organizations? So I think the key thing to remember is that everybody within your organization is a human being, right? Everyone you're trying to sell to in a market is a human being. And so you need to, and of course you yourself, right? You're also a human being. And we all make, for example, so if I'm trying to sell to you, trying to do something for you, we all make really obvious, typical mistakes. Now, the reason I do that is the same reason that you do that, Scott, and that, you do that, Jean, is that we all have human brains, and those brains are limited. They're absolutely remarkable, and they're limited. So, Jean, your brain works on the power of a dim incandescent light bulb.
That's where it's all gone wrong. On a good day.
And Scott, so does yours, right?
Oh, no.
And so does mine, and so does every listener out there, right? Every viewer out there. That's what our brain operates on, right? And still it does all these remarkable things. So we constantly, how does it do it? It does that by being efficient. It does that by using models of the world, right? It has to have models that simplify the world. Right, a model is a process that links senses to actions that help us achieve our goals, right? And those models will always be imperfect. They're extremely useful. They'll always be imperfect. They're imperfect in predictable ways. And just to give one tangible example of that, right back there in 2014, 2015, when we were really starting to grapple with a lot of these new issues in the science, we had to go back to basics. And it comes back to, I don't know if you guys, there was a famous, I think, 1960s marketing paper called Marketing Myopia by a chap called Levitt in the Harvard Business Review. The idea that people often think inside out rather than outside in. Right? And that's what so many different parts of the US government and the British government and the German government and the French government were doing back then. Right, thinking about what they wanted to do, not thinking about how key audiences in Russia or in Ukraine or in other places were actually thinking. And that is a really typical human thing to do, is to be too egocentric, to think inside out rather than outside in, put ourselves in the shoes of others. And so I'd say that is really one of the key things if you're thinking about how to convince people of something in your organization, if you're thinking about how to market things to people outside your organization. If you have a better understanding of how their brains actually work, you can put yourselves in their shoes and you can do a better job of marketing to them and changing their mindset if you so choose.
And it seems like we never seem to learn this because the Cold War was dominated with the two sides just doing that inside out thinking and arriving at a whole range of inaccurate conclusions, despite the billions that they were putting into that. And the subtext of your wonderful book, Warhead, is how the brain shapes war and how war shapes the brain. You've started to give us a kind of understanding of that relationship, and you unpack it in so many wonderful ways in terms of how people think, how they perceive reality, how they relate to one another. When you wrote that, what was the most surprising thing that you found?
So one thing that I didn't know beforehand was quite how important teaching and learning are. Right. So we think that we are very capable. I've done all of this stuff, and you guys are very. You've achieved all these different things. You've done all these different things in your lives, and you have all these different skills. But what we don't realise is how much of that is entirely cumulative. Is based upon what we had learned from others, right? And how absolutely central that is to humans. And it's something that I obviously I sort of knew, but I didn't realise. Quite how important that was and how much we can learn about that. So to give you an example, so humans are the only primates that teach, right? Other primates can learn. So a chimp, a juvenile chimp can learn from its mother how to crack a nut or whatever. But only humans, right, amongst all the primates, only humans actually teach, which is to put effort into trying to impart some kind of new knowledge, a new model of how the world works in some way, how to crack nuts, how to solve some kind of puzzle box, how to speak, how to do a podcast, right, how to market something, do whatever it is, how to account, double entry bookkeeping, whatever it is, right? We're the only animals that teach. And so one of the things that and I wouldn't have said that was so important, but that is actually absolutely central to everything we do. Every successful organization, every successful military organization, the teaching and learning. So we're also incredibly avid learners. Humans are incredibly avid learners, far more than any other primate. And that teaching learning spiral is absolutely central to every successful organization. So that's one thing, that cumulative thing. And then I just also say this comes a little bit back to the strength of our societies, which is that our societies also, that they rest on that type of cumulative effect, right? So we're often worried that society is falling apart, right? It's all a disaster. There's political polarization, all the rest of it. But the remarkable thing is not that society is falling apart. The remarkable thing is our societies are coherent enough to function at all, right? No other primate can get above 200-300 individuals in a coherent group, right? Human beings can. And how can we do that? It's a spiral. So it's not the teaching learning spiral, although it's related to that. It's the identity culture spiral. We have an identity which says, like, who am I? And then we have culture, which is the rules of how things are done around here. And that spiral takes years and years to change. And again, it's because we are so dependent on learning skills, right? That we have to make sure that we as humans can be in a functioning society where we can learn those skills from others. And so those take years to change. And I think this is something also that changed my perspective a little bit on a lot of questions about changes in organizational culture or changes in culture of societies, which is that it often takes years, right? Because these cultural bonds, these cultural ideas we have are so strong. They take years to form. They take years to change. And I'll give one tangible example of that. So in 1945, the Germans had lost World War II. Definitely 100% lost, right? No doubt about that. Cities had been pummeled, turned to dust and all the rest of it. And yet still, for years after that, right, between 1945 and 1949, consistently, a majority of Germans who were polled thought that Nazism was a good idea, badly applied. Right, still, consistently. Right, it took years of occupation, of reconciliation, all sorts of things to change how the Germans perceived the world. And that took years and years and years and years. So I'd say these two related ideas, the idea that teaching and learning being so fundamental, and the idea that culture is extremely important and it takes years to change. Those were two things that changed my understanding about how organizations and societies work at a really fundamental level.
What is the role of emotion in that, as you're talking about our unique capacity to build these sort of cultures and societies and organizing principles? I'm curious about, is the complexity and depth of our emotions, does that play a central role in our model making and our ability to care and our ability to sort of coalesce around sort of central ideas?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think So, I mean, the answer is, to some extent, yes, of course, emotions matter. The question is not whether emotions do or don't matter in many ways, unless you're a hardcore economist who think that thinks that everybody is, is doing everything rationally, which almost nobody believes. Even Alan Greenspan, I remember he wrote after the financial crisis an entire book saying maybe we should have taken a bit more account of human behaviour in our models. But the key question is, how can we think about fitting emotions within how human brains work? And so, so in the book, the way I think about the brain is, so I travel through the brain, look at 10 different brain areas. So I start right at the brain stem, right down at the bottom of the brain. And that does really basic things like heart rate, right? That type of thing, breathing. And then go all the way to the other end of the brain, right, through to 10 different brain regions, and the other end of the brain, the frontal pole, which is the very end of the brain, and that kind of does thinking about thinking. That's the most uniquely human part of the brain. Now, each of those, all these different brain regions, they all add really important new functions, right? Really important new things: perception, action, emotions, right? Vital drives like hunger and thirst and so on. And these brain regions all work together like an orchestra. So I'd say that's a really important metaphor, the metaphor of an orchestra. The brain is an orchestra of systems, and our emotions are a really important part of that orchestra, right? Now, animals also have emotions. It's very important to remember that. So this is not something that is, most remarkably human in that sense. And yet for you and me and everyone else, these are absolutely central to how we function, right? So I'll give you a tangible example again. This is fear. Right? So we think about fear as something that's bad, right? I don't want fear, or we don't like fear. But the thing is, fear is useful. We need fear, right? So, and fear in particular rests on what very important to fear is a tiny part of the brain, or small part of the brain, the size of an almond, called the amygdala, which is quite deep inside the brain. And the amygdala, you can actually lose the amygdala. There are some rare patients, and I've met some of them, who can lose this amygdala, this part of the brain. So they no longer feel fear and no longer see fear in others, right? And you might think this could make them become fearless criminals, for example, but that isn't what happens, right? What actually happens is they become, if they live somewhere a bit more dangerous, such as, I think you grew up in LA, you were saying, and there's a very famous case, a lady who's been studied extensively by the people at Caltech, and she lives in a not particularly pleasant part of LA. It's just quite a dangerous part of LA. And she is just often a victim of crime, right? Because she can't navigate her social world properly, because she doesn't have fear properly, and she can't see fear in others. So we need those emotions, right? And they are an important part of the orchestra systems in our brain. And then we also need to then think about how we can control those systems, right? So, and there are useful ways that we can control those, harness those, use them so that we can be more effective as individuals in our everyday life and at work, and of course in war as well.
So just coming back to the top of this conversation, when we talked about you're bringing this insight around how mental models is where the kind of new kind of territory of warfare is. What are you practically being asked to do by the White House or, the Pentagon or the office?
So I'll describe how the US system works fundamentally. So the area is divided, the world is divided up into areas, right? It's a bit like Imperial Rome. So I say that as a joke, but it is a bit like Imperial Rome. You have lots of different provinces, right? The whole world is split into different areas. There's, say, for example, you have CENTCOM, which is Central Command, which is the Middle East and so on. Then you have INDOPACOM, which is around sort of, China, India, Indian Ocean, Pacific. Now, each of those has a combatant commander, right? And then you have other functional commands. So there's geographical commands, and then there are functional commands. So, like the men and women who deal with nuclear weapons, for example. Now, the combatant commanders could have a difficult problem. And so what they'll often ask the group that I work with to do is to bring together an interdisciplinary set of approaches to understand that problem better. Because there's no one approach that's going to give you everything you need, right? So you need people who are anthropologists. So we have obviously exactly what we do will depend on the challenge, but there'll be anthropologists, there'll be people who are experts in, economics perhaps, or, computing, right? Political scientists, obviously, right? And so we will then come together and we will, I'm like the cognitive guy. That's my perspective, right? I don't say that the cognition is going to explain everything, but if you don't understand human beings, right, you're not going to be able to understand these tough challenges. Like, for example, how do we deter Vladimir Putin, right? So, whilst I was writing this book, every couple of weeks I'd have meetings with Stratcom, the people who are doing things to do with nuclear weapons. And the big challenge now is that how do they update their thinking about the ways that they plan to deal with a new reality, which is that now, like in the Cold War, there was just Russia. So it was Russia, essentially. There was Russia and the US, and it was just a two-body problem. But now it's a three-body problem because China is also a serious nuclear weapons state. So how can we think about deterring Russia and China from doing things you don't want them to do, right? And so central to that is cognition. Because what you're actually trying to do, and this is literally, I'm not saying anything that's, this is all in the public domain. Literally, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make a model you're trying to understand the way that a specific individual decision maker, somebody like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un or whoever, right, or a small number of people, how they will make a choice with certain whether to act or not act. Right, or which action they will take. And you're trying to understand their decision calculus from their perspective, right? And so what my job is to try and provide a more evidence-based, a more scientifically grounded understanding of the human nature that will affect how they make those decisions and how we can best influence those decisions. And that's what I would do. And so I provide insights about things like how to use surprise, how do you moderate surprise, how to use emotions, right? And that's one practical example that happened whilst I was literally writing that book of a task that we helped conduct there at the Pentagon. I wasn't the only person. There was a range of different perspectives, and often you need all of the different people coming together to really, come up with an effective set of solutions.
So we have this predicting brain that's constantly trying to reduce the amount of energy that it uses based on assumptions of the past. And now we have a situation with a combination of AI and certainties around globalization all changing at rapid speed. In a war scenario, you're dealing with constant ambiguity and surprise and so on. So when you're helping working in this multidisciplinary way, what is the thing that most leaders fail to notice about how they think about these things, do you think?
So the first thing I'll say is that people are often very negative about leaders, about military leaders.
Yeah.
But I've had the privilege of working with a large number of different military leaders in Britain and in America in particular, and there are a huge number of people that for which one can have a huge amount of respect. So I'll give you one practical, again, sort of example of that. The very first flag officer I briefed in person in the Pentagon. So this a flag officer is, an admiral or a general or whatever. The very first one I briefed, he was a brigadier general, and I briefed in the Pentagon, and we were in one of those, at places where you can't bring your telephones and all the rest of it come in, and he spends it well over an hour. And I'm briefing him about, the brain and how we can think about, at this point it was about deterring Iran and influencing Iran. This is some years ago, not the current conflict. And he was really interested in the brain, how the brain worked. I then edited a book on AI a couple of years later with people from Harvard and Stanford and so on. And he was then a major general, and he wrote a foreword for that book, right? Because he was interested. AI is important. I need to know about it, right? He's a tough guy, but he's a reflective, thoughtful, perceptive guy. He's now the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, right? Alexis Grinkovich. He's a 4-star. It's about as senior. He's pretty much as senior as you can get in the American military. And he is a reflective, thoughtful guy. Now, what kind of mistakes do those people make? So I'd say this is one of those things where people might think, oh, all these people are idiots. It's easy to say they're going to make loads of stupid mistakes, but that's not the case. And another important thing to remember is that people who make good generals in peacetime don't necessarily make good generals in wartime. So famously, George C. Marshall, he was the head of the US military, right, in World War II. He sacked the great bulk of the generals, right, early on. Just before the start of before World War II, because he needed to clear out the more peacetime generals and get in the more wartime generals. Now, what are the mistakes they most typically make? I would say probably it is and this is difficult because you're in a huge machine. Like if you're in Shell or BP or Google now or whoever it is, you're in a huge machine. But I would say, I'd say the most typical mistake is to focus too much on internal process and not focus enough on creatively generating outcomes, results that matter in the world, right? And I say that as somebody who spent quite a lot of time working with people on difficult challenges to do with, for example, the war on terror, right? And I also worked on the Kerry peace process in Israel-Palestine back in 2014 and so on. And people don't, they get too focused on the internal process, not enough on the outcomes. And they also don't learn enough. So I think, they don't, in fact, that would probably be the key thing. All plans, the classic thing of Eisenhower, right? Plans are worthless, but planning is everything, right? Or von Moltke, who was this famous German general, every plan, no plan suffers first contact with the enemy, right? You also change plans. But so I'd say probably it's not learning and updating their models of the world, their plans, their ideas, in light of the realities of the world that emerges in the conflict they're involved in. So I'd say that would probably be the key thing. It would be learning to focus, so you can focus creatively on results that matter rather than on process and internal process. I'd say that's probably the thing I've seen most. But again, I don't want to be negative because these guys are dealing with extremely difficult challenges, and a lot of them are doing a really great job.
I love that you're saying this, and John and I coach leaders on this all the time about focusing on outcomes instead of inputs. The challenge becomes getting them to actually do that, particularly under stress and pressure or when the amygdala is hijacked, right? How do you think about your thinking and take a wide angle view and stay focused on outcomes? I'd love to hear more. I'd love you to unpack this further in terms of what you're seeing or from a brain perspective. How can people get better at actually doing this?
So one of the most effective ways of doing it, if you're actually going to speak to, say, for example, you're actually briefing General Grinkovich now. I haven't met him for a few years, but, everyone like that is unbelievably busy, right? And often the way to really get something through is to have a tangible story or example or analogy. So I'll give you a few analogies that can help, illustrate some of these ways that we can better think about our own thinking, right? So we can be more effective. So, there was almost nobody who was busier than Winston Churchill during World War II. He was a very busy guy, right? Not only because he packed about 1.5 working days into every day, and he took almost no vacations for the whole of World War II, bearing in mind, but he was obviously an extremely busy guy. And yet he actively took time to reflect. Right. This is a man who, stamped action this day stickers on his, on key orders. Right. He was a man of action, and yet he deliberately took time to reflect. And so I think one of the key things is to say to people, look, really, almost whoever you are, you're not under more stress than Winston Churchill in World War II. And if he can take time to stop and reflect, then you can as well. Right. So I think that's one example that the importance of reflection is there. And that's because you can then see the bigger picture. And so he was able, for example, to see the bigger picture, to move troops and resources from between theatres, because he could see the bigger picture. And he deliberately took the most of things like, for example, when he was on a ship that was sailing to the US, right? He took advantage of that time to reflect. So that's one example, Winston Churchill. Another thing is about having a good tapestry of knowledge, a range of different analogy of examples from which you can draw. This is for people perhaps often who are a little bit more junior, right? Because you can build this, or more middle grade, because you can build this tapestry of knowledge. You can build your tapestry of knowledge, different sets of analogies you can bring to bear. So a good example here is Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the Allied Supreme Commander during D-Day. He was a middling officer, not doing enormously well, but in many ways, and he got a not particularly plum posting to Panama. Right, so he was sent off to Panama, not like the most amazing posting when he was a middle grade officer, but there he had a fantastic mentor. And again, this comes out to teaching learning thing. But Eisenhower had this fantastic mentor who forced him to read lots of different examples, right, different stories, different historical episodes, and that turbocharged Eisenhower's career. And again, if you think you're too busy to do that, another great example here is Nelson Mandela. I don't know if you've ever been to Robben Island, where he was incarcerated. I mean, the guy was in a prison cell not much bigger than the desk, the table in front of us, John, right? And yet, if Nelson Mandela can read widely, think widely, educate people, do a remarkable job, right? Build his knowledge, then I think, very few of us are in quite such difficult circumstances, being incarcerated for years on Robben Island by an apartheid regime. Another thing is about feedback and discussion. Now, Joseph Stalin is a good example here. You might not think that he was a man who was happy to literally purge, and by purge, that doesn't mean giving them a slap on the wrist and sending them to the naughty step. The guy was prepared to, a lot of people, he killed a lot of people who didn't agree with him, right? But actually, in World War II, one of the reasons why he did better in World War II than Adolf Hitler was that Hitler increasingly, to begin earlier on in the war, when he had, let's be honest, alas, and it gives me no pleasure to say, enormous military successes, he worked largely by committee. He had other people who could inform his ideas, right? And often a better way we can think about our own thinking is to have other people tell other people our plans, and then they can interrogate them, right? Other people can give us honest feedback and so on. And Hitler increasingly failed to do that during World War II, whereas Stalin actually, as did Churchill, as did Roosevelt, ran the war by committee. Committees are often derided, but having people who can give us honest feedback is a really useful thing. And I'll give you one last example, another practical way of doing this, which is that there's this, so we can be more aware of the typical errors that we make in our thinking. Right, so one way we can improve our thinking about our own thinking is that we can be aware of the typical errors we make, and then that means we can try and avoid them. So I'll give you an example, which is that when we think we really know something, right, when we're very fluent, right, so this idea of fluency, when you're very fluent in understanding something, then you're overconfident about it, right? So try and see things from a new perspective where you won't be as fluent, where you won't have this false fluency that can trick you into being more confident than you should be. So to give you an example, one of the things I did at the end of the book was I looked at the last 25, 30 years of history, not from the typical Western perspective, right, British or American or whatever, because I lived through quite a bit of that history. I know a lot of the key players and so on, but I looked from a Chinese perspective. I tried to take a different perspective and look from a Chinese perspective. And then when you see the last 25 years of world history from a Chinese perspective, you start seeing it in a different way. Right? 9/11, for example, was a really big deal in America, and I'm not belittling in any way, but it just simply was not as big a deal in China. And that's not because they weren't good guys. It's just that it was something that happened very far away in a different country. Mm-hmm. So that's another practical way, again, so take time to reflect, build a better tapestry of knowledge, get feedback from others, and try and avoid erroneous fluency, for example, by taking a new perspective. Those are all practical ways that we can enhance our metacognition, or thinking about thinking.
Those are incredibly useful practical strategies. I think it might be worth just doing a little sidebar on what metacognition is, because we talk about it as thinking about thinking, but one of our previous guests on our other show, with Steve Fleming, who you know.
Well. He's a character in the book. In fact, he's my daughter's godfather. There we go.
Wonderful.
So, terrible guy, handsome, brilliant rugby player, incredibly clever, awful guy. Loathe him.
Successful. But, you talk about when you were working with him, uncovering these kind of 4 levels of metacognition. Is that right?
Yeah, you are right. Yeah, I didn't do that. We didn't do that. I have done. Steve and I have worked together, like doing metacognition research, and in fact testing people in China at Peking University and other places. But that research is done by somebody else. The specific thing of many. In fact, although my daughter, this is one of those classic things. My daughter, who's 11, she went to Steve's. I took her to Steve's inaugural lecture when he got his professorship at UCL. And she was too shy to say her question because there were all of these august professors and all the rest of it. She was only, I think, 10 or 11. And she said to me afterwards, Daddy, if there's thinking about thinking, can you have thinking about thinking about thinking? And I was like, wow, Cece, that is an excellent question. So I emailed Steve and he was like, yes, there's a great paper about thinking about thinking about thinking and even thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking. Sorry. Anyway, that's the question you were talking about. So I didn't do it.
This is metacognition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, pausing here for just a moment to underscore this idea of metacognition, because John, this is a concept that you and I have been discussing for years. We've discussed it on our previous show, The Evolving Leader, and now it's already coming up on the Mindset Economy, and I'm sure it's going to continue to be a point of conversation as the capacity and capability to think about one's thinking is a critical component of mindset building, and it's essential in the Mindset Economy.
Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is that when we first started talking about this, it was definitely confined to a niche academic topic. And what we're doing on this show is we're not trying to add to just more performance hacks that people have got to make themselves more efficient and fall into this kind of treadmill of trying to be the best version of yourself from an efficiency perspective. This is actually exactly what you're talking about, which is expanding our capacity for judgment, because AI without human judgment is just compute going around in circles, as Satella Nadella said a couple of weeks ago in his thought piece. So I think, it's incredibly important in terms of it actually differentiates us in an automated world. It's not about trying to keep up with machines. It's trying to differentiate us from them.
Yeah. And what I love is that Nick lays out, very practical ways, 4 pragmatic ways to harness metacognition, taking actual time to reflect. And I don't just mean, when you're in the bathroom or stuck in traffic, but building an actual discipline of intentional reflection. Also, building a wider tapestry of knowledge, getting real feedback, being open to real feedback, and forcing yourself to look at things from a completely different perspective.
Yeah, it's about breaking that false confidence that when metacognition is not very at work, that we can stay in the comfort zone of what we think we already know. So let's get back to the conversation with Nick and pull back the curtain on how these brain models are being used to anticipate major global events in the world right now. I think the point about this, when it comes to judgment, there could be no more crucial, consequential decisions you make than on the battlefield or on a theatre of war. And this idea of helping leaders to build their ability to update their beliefs in light of new information so they don't become inside-out thinkers. Where are you seeing that in the current conflicts that are happening? Where are you seeing it good and bad, that it might be influencing things in Iran or in Ukraine?
So I think there are different levels or ways you can think about it. So one of the first things to say is that so US military officers on the whole are better educated and more reflective than those military officers elsewhere on the whole. Something you may not, I don't know, you might disagree with, but to give you an example, I put together a thing a while ago about this is very inside baseball type stuff, but JAD C2, which is this command and control thing. And then there was just this major general who had a PhD in computer science, who was just happy to come and have a chat and a serving major. You know what I mean? Amazing bench they have in America. They really take it very seriously. And I think partly that is that the US in particular has a very good, so everybody basically copied the general staff. So I work with the Pentagon Joint Staff, right? All of these staffs are all copies, essentially, of an institution that was founded at the beginning of the 19th century by Karl von Clausewitz and others, which was the Prussian General Staff.
Yeah.
So what you can do with that, and this is a wonderful example of how you can create institutions that then create cultures, and they can change how individuals work, and they can make really effective individuals. And often this can go on for decades, right? So bear in mind, von Clausewitz, so the Prussian General Staff was essentially a way of teaching officers. The Prussian army thought it was the best army in the world, but the best army in Europe, and they were defeated by Napoleon, the genius. He was a military genius, essentially, Napoleon, right? He could bring up these incredible plans in his head, right? What it would take a whole staff of people to, later on to do, he could do in his own head. He was a military genius. So what the Prussians wanted to do was turn a talented officer, but not a genius, right, into a really effective decision maker. And so they produced a way of doing that, which was training and then operating in this general staff. And part of that was about reflecting. And it was about reading, writing, reflecting. And so, for example, Clausewitz literally marked the homework of von Moltke the Elder, who was a key general who won a series of victories in the 1860s, Prussian general, and that helped form Germany. And this went right down to World War II, right? You had this incredible, and so the Germans, it's something we forget in America or Britain or wherever, right? The Germans, and again, it gives me no pleasure to say this, as you know from the front of that, but my relatives fought against the Germans for many years. But the Germans were better than us on land, right, at fighting. They were better in attack, they were better in defense, they were better when they had air cover and when they didn't have air cover. Right, and a lot of that was to do with the incredible this institution of the Prussian and then German general staff, and we all copied that. So in Britain we have the general staff, and in America they have the joint staff. And so I'd say the Americans, like the ability of Americans to American military planners, is really absolutely without equal in the world. Like, I think if they'd had half a dozen American planners helping the Russians in February 2022, they're that good. They're extremely good. So I think on that level, they're extremely good. But I think then there's another level, which is, what is the political goal that we're trying to achieve, of which these military instruments are part of it? So I think they did do that with the Venezuela raid, right? That was an explicitly lethal force. This was the raid that took out Maduro captured Maduro in January this year. But the purpose of that wasn't it. The purpose of that, again, was about to influence the regime in Caracas. They didn't want to do regime change. They wanted to influence that regime. Right. So that there was a political goal, and the military instrument helped achieve that political goal. And I think that's where I'd say perhaps sometimes the Americans haven't done such a good job, is in that part of the process. They're very good at the reflection and execution, perhaps at what was called the operational level, military planning, but slightly less good sometimes, not always, as in Venezuela, but slightly less good sometimes at the political, integrating the political and military goals together.
This question of what is it that we're trying to achieve is seemingly so simple, and yet oftentimes I think leaders and people lose sight of asking themselves that question and become quite solution-led, sort of falling in love with their ideas of what they want to achieve, and they're not sort of letting the problem take them where they need to go. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts from a brain science perspective of what's happening there. Why do we fall in love with our solutions and activities and lose sight of what it is we actually are trying to achieve?
It's a great question. And this also comes a little bit back to, I know that you're interested in AI, not as an end in itself, but as a, so one of the big challenges we face with AI is what's called the alignment problem. How do we get AI to do stuff, right, that we want it to do, right? So typically within AI, like literally what you're doing is you set it a task, right? There's what's called an objective function. You say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, right? Or X, right? And the classic problem here is that how do you specify that objective? So, and one example people often give is paperclips. You ask the AI that can, that's in charge of factories to make paperclips. But then what it does is it decides the best way to make paperclips is to turn us all, like kill all the humans. You turn all of our factories and all of our stuff into paperclip making stuff, and then sail off into, the thing and make more paperclips on other planets, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we define these goals? And that's extremely difficult, right? And that's extremely difficult for an AI. I would say it's actually essentially impossible in important ways. And so what we end up with is like, what is the ultimate goal? So I don't want to get like too metaphysical, Scott and Jean, but what is the goal of your life? Yeah, like what is the ultimate goal? Like what is the ultimate purpose? Like you're doing this episode of the podcast to get a slightly different perspective, like using war and stuff, gives different perspective on the issues you're interested in. Then the podcast part of a series, and then that series is part of a thing, and it's part of a thing. But like, what's the point? So actually, it's very difficult to know what the point is, right? And it's open to debate. And it's the same for AI, and it's the same for humans. And so often we have to work in the realm of process, right? So you were saying that why do leaders get stuck in doing something, but we have to, because that is actually how we run most of our life. So the way our models of the world work is they're hierarchical models in the sense that there are lower level components making this podcast, higher level components having a series of podcasts, whatever it is that you hope to achieve beyond that. So we have to work at these lower levels, and we often get stuck in process because that's just the way our brains work, and indeed that they have to work. And also, like say for example, you are the CEO of a company. What is your goal? Often your goal actually, is probably is a mixture of different things. Your own career, right? Your shareholders, other stakeholders, depending on what type of country. If you're Germany, for example, if you're in Germany, you have the workers' council and the rest of it. And I think often that's why you have really good leaders like Winston Churchill. You have really good institutions that can help you do it, like the General Staff for their military reflection, for example. People don't necessarily apply that question of what is we're really trying to achieve here. And I think that's because you're always working up against the challenge that this is, to some extent, an insoluble problem, and all we can ever do is manage the problem. We can never definitively work out exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve.
So this might be more of a philosophical rather than a scientific question. But as you start to think about, you write about this paradox about self-knowledge, and that our brain is actively resisting self-knowledge. But if we think about your daughter and my children and Scott's children, given what you're thinking about here and this world that they're going to grow up into, what is going through your mind in terms of the things that we can help them to navigate more successfully forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is it's not so much, it's the classic thing. Everyone makes mistakes raising their kids, and then you correct those mistakes and you make other mistakes. It's the classic thing, isn't it? So whatever we do, we'll get it wrong in some regards. That's important. But what I would say is that it's more about, so rather than like specific brain science that we should be teaching them, it's more, I'd say at the moment, I think some aspects of the way we are raising children has gone too far in some particular directions. And I think it would be good to try and sort of correct those a little bit. That will be, I think that's the most important thing. I'll come on to that, and then there are just some facts about the world that I'll come on to as a second thing. So I think one of the things that we, and I'm not the only person to say this, but now I think we are not setting children up often to deal with failure, to deal with getting things wrong, to deal with losing, and all of us lose, all of us fail, all of us make mistakes, and I think when we are too when we mollycoddle the children too much, essentially, that doesn't mean you need to be supportive, and in addition to that, allow them to fail and learn that failure is something that you can get over and learn from. Is often it sounds like a strange thing, but Mao Zedong, right? One of the key things he said was actually, when he was thinking about learning, was you have to learn from failures, right? And we all see that in our life. You have to learn from your failures and be able to be resilient and come back from failures. So I'd say that's one key area with children. And another thing is that we are remarkably resilient. So I think children need to know they are often remarkably resilient. So at the front of the book you see there my great uncle Sidney, who is and so he was in World War II, and he was an officer in a British tank commander in World War II. He's an Operation Torch, if you know, which is a big Anglo-American landing on the west coast of North Africa, and then he fought his way all the way out through Italy, and won a military cross at the High Award for bravery. And he was in the war for years, and famously in family law, whether it's true or not, I don't actually know. So I'm not going to test this theory to destruction because I don't want to find. But of his class at Sandhurst, which is the military training officers training seat, there were only 3 of them who survived without death or serious injury, and he was one of them. This was an extremely dangerous thing. He got through all of that. Right. And the picture at the beginning of that book is him holding my then baby son at my great uncle Sidney's 100th birthday, right, in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England, in a hotel in Brighton, and he was having a lovely time surrounded by friends and family. And I remember as a happy man, he used to push me around his garden in a wheelbarrow when I was a kid, and all the rest of it. Right. We are remarkably resilient, and I think that is another thing that we need to remember, is that we're remarkably resilient. Yeah. So learning from failures, and that actually humans are a lot more resilient. We don't need to worry quite so much about anxiety and fears and all the rest of it. Actually, often that's not to minimize that in a small number of people and so on, but we're actually a lot more resilient than people think. And then a bigger issue, which is just that I think we need to see ourselves as humans as the good in us and the bad in us, and that will always be that will always be part of what it is to be human, right? So war will always be part of what we are as humans, right? There will always be the potential for conflict. There will always be conflict. We will never, in my opinion, ever get to a world where there is no possibility of serious war. I don't think that is possible, because we are humans, and there are so many aspects as we travel through the brain. There's not one simple reason why we fight wars. There are many different reasons to do with many different brain systems that we have. But then on the other hand, we also make peace. We have the ability as humans to collaborate more than any other animals in the whole world, which is also remarkable. So I'd say that broader picture that they will potentially face big challenges in the future. At the end of the book, I give my probability that my children, there will be a global catastrophe, something on the scale of World War I or World War II, I'd say, and that could be a pandemic, not like COVID, which is a really, by the grand scheme of things, a much smaller thing. So again, not to minimise those, and I went back to trade, work in hospital during COVID and so on myself. But a really big thing like World War I or World War II, I'd say there's about a 1 in 3 chance by the end of the century. But the thing is, the majority of people did get through World War II okay. And the majority of people will get through, just like my great uncle Sidney, the majority of people will get through these big challenges okay. And we are actually making the world a better place. The world is a better place now than, in my opinion, it was 50 years ago. And it was better then than 50 years before that. Right? So I think we should also be hopeful and realistic about what it is to be human.
I love everything you just said, and I'd love to hold it up against the backdrop of the speed of change. I'm in so many conversations on a sort of weekly basis about how fast the world is changing now. So you mentioned that it's better, but it seems to be moving a lot quicker. And sometimes it feels like mentally and emotionally, it's hard to keep up. So I'd love to get your comments and thoughts on that.
Well, the first thing to say is that everybody always says we're living in a time of change. I remember seeing a while ago that they have the National Security Strategy, which is published each 4 years by each new incoming administration in the US, and every single one says we're in a time of unprecedented change. It's really remarkable. Everything's different. And it's like, really? Is everything? But I would say this time really is different, which is also another terrible thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I'd say this time really is different. I think we're in a transition phase. And the reason for that is just brute power shifts in the world, right? In my opinion now, we're in a world where there are really only two massive centers of power, and they are so dominant I'm literally speaking to you, Scott. Here we go. You're in America. That's one of the giant centers of power, right? And the other is China, right? America absolutely dominates in weightless industries, things like AI, right? Movies, music, all the rest of it, science, despite funding cuts before you say it, but and whatever, right? Just to put that in perspective, Nvidia is now worth its market capitalization is roughly the equivalent of every single one of the top 40 French companies. Sorry, Jean, if you are French, and plus every single one of the top 40 German companies. That's just one of America's mega corporations, right? I advise Europe's largest company, right? It was founded which is SAP, which is a tech company. It was founded over 50 years ago, right? But no companies in the whole of Europe, right, or in any rich democracy other than the US have been founded in the last 50 years and now worth over $100 billion market capitalization, right? And sustained there, right? With the exception of SoftBank, which is a speculator. America is absolutely dominant in lots of ways, but China is absolutely dominant physically, right? China now produces more than the next 4 or maybe even 9 countries in the world combined in terms of manufacturing. They dominate advanced manufacturing now, right? In 2024, China produced 12 million electric vehicles. The whole of the rest of the world only produced like 4.5 million, right? BYD alone produces more electric vehicles each year than the entirety of the former automotive powerhouse Germany, right? Germany, every type of German car, petrol, diesel, hybrid, right? China, so dominant. Now, the world we're having is a world that is crystallizing around that reality of American and Chinese dominance and very asymmetric dominance, because America is now a manufacturing, is not very strong at manufacturing in many ways. So China, for example, has 240 times America's shipbuilding capacity. So if there was a war in the Western Pacific, obviously that's a massive issue for the United States, right? So China and America are both unbelievably powerful, and they both have fundamental weaknesses. And the whole world is now crystallizing around, in my opinion, that reality. So yes, I think we really are in a period of significant change. And I think your podcast is on the money in terms of it's about mindset. So I think when you're in a period that is roughly stable, then institutions and procedures and ways of doing things that are codified, they are excellent because that they're set up for meeting the challenges of that time. But we're now in a different time. There's a transition, there's a shift, there's a transformation in the entire way the world is working. Not just to do with AI, that's important, but also to do with global power shifts. And as a consequence, individuals, human beings, the ability to adapt, the ability to solve problems, that suddenly becomes much more important. And so I would say this would be so your question was, how can we deal better with this challenge? I think the first thing to say is that people are not wrong. I think things really are shifting more than they were like when I was younger. I think that's just a fact about the world. First of all, to recognize that, so it's not surprising, so that we can cope with it better. And then the next thing I'd say is that it is about being more flexible. I think people have to invest more in their own personal training, and that also do things like, having a go with Claude, for example, as I did the other day. I programmed an app, the other day, just to test out the new, the latest capabilities, right? I think we're going to have to do that type of thing. Obviously, I do a lot of stuff with other stuff with AI, but I just haven't used Claude, just to be clear, for this specific purpose of the new coding. So I think that's the way we're going to have to deal with it, is to understand the world really is shifting, and we're going to have to try and be more adaptive and learn better and train ourselves better as individuals.
And how are you thinking about AI? What's your how's that relationship developing?
I mean, so I'd say, so I've done a lot of work on AI over the years. So I did my PhD in the lab at DeepMind just spun out of, and so, I was doing, computer programming and stuff, which now, again, because of Claude, I'm like, well, I don't know why I bothered to learn that, alas. So I think the key thing here about is, if you speak to any futurist, the first thing they'll say is there's no such thing as this is the future. They will always say futures, right? So, I sit there with people from Google and all the other places, they're like, basically, just all we need to work out is how to pay for all of the people who have nothing to do, because almost no one, scientists, waiters, taxi drivers, they're all going to be unemployed within the next few years. And so how do we pay for them to do something that's, and I'm like, well, I mean, possibly. But that's one potential future, right? But actually that's the much less likely idea that we're going to get this massive recursive, so like, AI improving AI, and it getting to super intelligence, causing the end of the, huge issues in that sense, possibly the end of the world. It's possible, but I think that's a less likely scenario. I think the more likely scenario is that AI will be a new technology like electricity, which is very powerful, and it will change a large number of industries, especially knowledge industries like writing, producing content like these podcasts and so on. I think it's going to really change a lot of those industries fundamentally. And if you're not thinking about how you can get out of industries that are going to be, eviscerated, essentially, or be on the right side of the change, then I think that, that's going to be highly problematic for you over the next, 10 to 15 years. So I think I would I'd see it as more likely to be like another industrial revolution. And we've had a number of different, we had the first one was here in Britain, and then you had another one which we've had a variety, then we had electricity, internal combustion engine and so on, and then we had computing, and I think this will be another one. You could call it the fourth industrial revolution, or I call it the nth industrial revolution, because there's so much discussion about how many we've had. But I think this will just be a new industrial revolution, and that will have ramifications across many different areas of society. There are risks to do with that transition, and we have to try and, for us as individuals and for us as societies, and we have to try and mitigate those as best we can, and take the opportunities, because it will hopefully, I also think, makes us, if we have dark factories, this idea of dark factories, which are factories that are so robotized that you can turn the lights off, because robots don't need light, right? Like if they can produce loads of stuff in those factories, if we can have an electrified economy like they have, they're building in China, right? If we can do all of this without the world turning into catastrophe, which I think there's a good chance that we can, then that will make the world a better, cleaner, more pleasant, lovelier place for many of us. So I'm optimistic.
What are the risks around AI and warfare?
Well, the first thing to say is that a lot of people say, we shouldn't use, AI, it is absolutely impossible that cutting edge militaries will not use AI, right? You will not be able to compete if you don't use AI, right? You look at the tempo of what the US is doing in Iran, right? And we know that they're now using a lot of AI to do this in terms of target selection and creating operational plans and so on. Like, if you're the Chinese and you're not using AI to compete with that, you're not going to be able to compete, right? If the Russians are effective, tough guys who learn and improve, yet they made a horrible set of blunders in February 2022 militarily, but they've actually learned, and they've now become much more effective in many ways, right? With the number of years they've spent in Ukraine. If we're going to go up against them, right? Which is far from in the Western Europeans, which is far from impossible. Then we're going to have to be able to use these technologies, right? And that's especially the case if we're not going to lose a lot of human lives. So, how do we want to fight the Russians? Do we want to fight the Russians as the Ukrainians are having to do it, which is with thousands of deaths and casualties every month, or are we going to try and do it in a more technologically sophisticated way? I mean, we are going to try and do it in a more technologically sophisticated way because that is simply better for us. So we will use AI, is what I'm saying. It is absolutely impossible that we're not going to use AI. And already, so for example, if you look back at drones, so last September, I think, the first public reports emerged of a swarm of drones that had been given a target by, this is in Ukraine, who'd been given a target by a human commander. And then the swarm of drones decided itself how it would deliver lethal force. Right, that's the first time that had been publicly reported. Now, that's what Ukraine is doing. And Ukraine is far less technologically sophisticated in many ways than America and China and Britain and Germany and so on. So this is where it's all going to go. Now, then, how do we think about this? This is about something about morality. So we're going to have humans controlling swarms of drones, right? And there'll be, especially if it's a US-China scenario, I think you're likely to have a relatively small number of humans controlling swarms of drones in America and a relatively small number of humans controlling swarms of drones from China. And that the drones will be doing drone on drone. It'll be like the Battle of Britain, where you have a relatively small number of technologists dueling with each other. I think that's where we're going to get to. Now, how are the humans going to control those drones? It'll be the human will be on the loop. The drones will be making most of the decisions. The swarm of drones will be making the decision. The humans will be on the loop, overseeing that, giving them intent, and trying to stop them doing things they don't want them to do, right, as well, if there's like civilian casualties and so on. Although some civilian casualties will always be a possibility in war. That's the way war works, alas. Now, how do you do that? So how does the human communicate with the swarm of drones? Right, that involves understanding the human, and it involves understanding communication, and it involves understanding the swarm of drones, right? And I think that's very much like one of the next frontiers, how we can get those to work. And then also within those drones, we're going to have to build in AI morality, because the drones are going to be making a lot of decisions on their own. And they are going to have to be able to make those decisions in a way that is broadly consistent with our moral and rules of engagement that we prescribe in our societies, whatever those are. And so we're going to have to build that in as well.
Something analogous is going to happen in organizations where a small number of people are managing vast number of agents who are acting in consequential ways. The degree of moral reasoning needed on both sides of that equation. How do you think about that in terms of accountability? Because you've got this enormous power now that we didn't have in the past. How do we build in the guardrails that aren't just about coding, but also about leadership?
I mean, so I think, so if you have it, so humans have always used tools. Right. The reason why, and I'm sorry, Scott, again, compared to a juvenile chimp, you're a weedy guy.
Wait, did you just compare me to a juvenile chimp?
I said compared to, I not favorably.
John does that all the time. So
and not favorably.
I'm going to keep that clip.
Right. And the same with me, right? Because human beings are weedy, right? We have, compared to chimps, right? We have our bowels are 60% of the length they should be. Our jaws are puny because we have tools, right? We have tool using animals, right? We grind corn and we cook things and whatever. And that's why we don't need really powerful jaws, because we can cook stuff. So we've always used tools. Now, the type of tools, so often the type of tool we have, it might be a hammer, an inert tool, right? Or something that always produces the same outcome. Like you type 4 + 4 into a calculator and it will give you the number 8 every time, right? Normal calculator. So you have these much simpler tools. And then you have a colleague, another human being, like you two work together as a team, right? And that there's a lot going on there in the way that you communicate and do things together as a team. Now, what this new AI is, this generative AI, is it's somewhere in the middle of that tool-colleague spectrum, because actually the generative AI is probabilistic, it's highly sophisticated and complex, and it can come out with different answers on different occasions and with really very subtle differences in the prompts. Now, we humans have actually often operated with like things like that before, like a dog. Right? We domesticated dogs, right? Or a horse, right? A horse can do a lot of what it wants to do, and we have to communicate with it and tell it what we want it to do, train it, change the context in which it works, all the types of things you do with prompt engineering and all the rest of it, right? We've worked within this type of situation with these types of things, somewhere between an inert hammer and a colleague. We've worked with things like dogs and horses before. So that's where I think we are. And then in addition to that, because they're probabilistic, I think a lot of this is going to come down to, are you acting reasonably? And is the AI acting reasonably? And so I think a lot of it will be, especially in America, it will come down to law. You know, it's like so I'm a medical doctor, but I don't practice medicine anymore. But you know, every doctor makes mistakes. Every doctor gets things wrong, certainly with the benefit of hindsight. That is absolutely inevitable, because even if you do your best. But the point is, were you acting reasonably? Did you do your best? Did you do a reasonable job in that situation? And I think that's where we're going to end up with a lot of these AIs. There will be a division of responsibility between the user and the AI, and how do you divide out that responsibility? And I think a lot of that's going to be, because it's probabilistic now, with these AIs, there's going to be that type of division. It'll be legal, it'll be organizational, it'll be about ideas about what's reasonable. And again, I think because they're so sophisticated now and they're becoming increasingly powerful, we're going to have to try and build in morality in some broad sense, rules of engagement. And that will just be a necessary part of how all those AIs work, because I just see no alternative, given that we cannot control every aspect of what it is that they're doing.
It's fascinating. And it comes back to, again, full circle to metacognition in terms of your ability to know whether you are being reasonable, whether you are considering those things.
Yeah, I mean, and they are, metacognition is part of, so if you think about how, so not far from, well, just, it is actually a bit, it's about 5 miles from here, is Queen Square, right? The Institute of Neurology, where I work in London, which is a brain science sort of area, sort of leafy square in London. And both the 2024 Nobel Prizes in AI have strong links to Queen Square, strong links to neuroscience. So Geoffrey Hinton, right, who came up with a lot of the artificial neural networks that underlie a lot of what we're doing now and why people are excited about AI. So he was at Queen Square, so at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, and he was explicitly trying to build, you know, if you listen to him, he was explicitly trying to build a human brain. Demis Hassabis, so he and I had a desk in the same office for a little bit whilst he was finishing his PhD, and I was starting mine. And Demis looked at the brain, he studied the brain. Explicit, you know, he did a proper functional brain imaging PhD, just like I did, right? He looked at the hippocampus and imagination, right? Now, everything we've been really, the really big things with AI in many ways have been to do with giving it new human style capabilities. So the big leap in 2012 was the reason why people got excited about AI was the ImageNet. It was giving machines near and then soon up better than human capabilities of visual object recognition, right? A picture of a monkey, a picture of a spoon, a picture of a balloon, a picture of a bottle, right? Identifying objects. Then the big thing, obviously, with November-ish 2022, fall 2022, autumn 2022, as I'm in London, was language, right? Yeah, and ChatGPT was amazing at language. It was the ability to have language, right? The next big things are, I've been writing about this for a while, and I'm pleased that the head of NVIDIA also agrees with this. Is that, because he's quite a successful guy, is world models, right? So physical things, and so already you're seeing robots that are able to do quite remarkable things, right? Although they're not able to yet as of the time of this podcast, they're not able to fold a basket of laundry, right? But that's the next type of thing. And I think metacognition, to get back to your point, metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, right? Understand how confident you are, how confident you should be, how good your level of confidence is in your own decisions, in your own perception, in your own actions, in your own feelings. That metacognition is something, in my opinion, that will be a crucial building block for AI in the not too distant future.
Wonderful.
So just building on that, cognition conversation and AI, what are the risks or potential futures, I guess, in terms of AI's impact on our cognition? So, there's some early publications and studies around the idea that back in the search engine days of, knowing where to find information instead of knowing something became kind of maybe the first step in that, but we at least had to parse through the information that Google provided. And now we're sort of offloading a lot of our thinking into AI and we're not engaging with it. And how do we make sure, or what are your thoughts on the potential risks associated with what AI is going to do to our cognition if we don't use it wisely?
So I could cheat and look at I wouldn't say.
Are you going to ask AI?
Yeah, no. I could cheat and say that, and there's an element of truth to this, that's what could be called an empirical question. We can't ahead of time know, right? But I think there's a good amount of evidence, and we know, for example, that the structure of our brains can change depending on your experiences. So to give you an example, a famous study was done in London at Queen Square, actually, which is about London taxi drivers. So London taxi drivers, black cab drivers, have to do something called the knowledge. They have to learn thousands and thousands of streets and landmarks, and they're tested on, take me from, Trafalgar Square to Putney Bridge or whatever, and they have to tell you exactly how they would get there. And learning the knowledge changes the structure of their brain, changes the structure of their hippocampus. So that was what Demis Hassabis's supervisor, that was her most famous set of studies, right? So we know it can change the structure of the brain, but is this a much larger change than other changes that have happened in the last, say, 250 years? So let me give you an example. The majority of people in early 19th century Britain were illiterate. And so we've learnt to read and write. Now, is that a bigger change? And then we got, radio, and then we got television, right? And now we can all talk, then we got, I had a Nokia telephone or whatever, an Ericsson, I had, it'd send text messages. We could all. So is this new AI offloading of some aspects of thinking? I think you're entirely correct. This is important, but is it going to be a much bigger change than those changes? I think I would say probably not. It could be different, and it will affect different aspects of our cognition, but I don't think it's going to be bigger. The other thing I'd say is that this is something that, again, we have to anticipate. So our brains are expectation machines. We should be good at anticipating. We need to anticipate this. So how, for example, like I remember about 3 years ago at I'm affiliated with the National Defense University in Washington, and they were like, Nick, all of because they had, they got lots of American military officers there, and they were like, Nick, like loads of these officers are using AI to write their essays, basically, and whatever. And there was a whole discussion about the degree to which, I was like, well, just get them to write some stuff using a pen and paper. This is not beyond the wit of man to solve this, at least part of this challenge. It's important they should know how to use AI, and it's important you have those sets of skills, but you can also check how they think through things and their ability to have enough factual knowledge themselves and enough ability to structure answers and coherently construct a sophisticated argument. You could test that using pen and paper. And so I think actually we need to anticipate that, exactly as you say, that a lot of these things could, because clearly if people never write their own essay at all, if you're doing a history degree and you basically never write an essay, I don't understand how you can say anything useful about history. So I completely agree that they will become totally de-skilled. But I think we could just get some people to write things with pen to paper. And also, for example, if if we to some extent have to artificially create junior jobs for lawyers and others, well, that's what we have to do. That's part of the training, because we'll still need some lawyers who can rise up through the ranks to oversee AI agents, if only because they are the people whose names will have to be signed on a piece of paper saying, I take responsibility that I have done due diligence, or whatever it would be appropriately. Mm-hmm. So I think we can anticipate this. I don't think it's going to radically change the structure of our brains in terrible ways, but I do think it's important, and I think we need to think through practical mitigating strategies, such as writing exams at universities with pens and paper, and making sure we have good training for more junior people in organizations where junior people are going to become, in some cases, superfluous.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I think we've probably run out of time.
You can cut it down to an amazing 10 minutes.
Not at all. What's your next kind of area of focus? What's the problem you're currently working on?
Yeah. So I think I'm at the moment thinking about the big challenge of how we are going to work in a more imperial world, in which America and China are so much more powerful than everywhere else, and within those, and their power is quite asymmetric. And how does America cope with this? If you don't mind me saying, you were talking about you moved from California to Tennessee,
yeah,
right? I mean, that is, I was how does America cope with the huge inequalities that are going to emerge, or have already emerged and are already emerging? The fact that, I really liked the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson book, Abundance, and there are other people working that more on the right of the political spectrum. And then, I was seeing the other day that Texas has pretty much as much battery capacity now as almost all of the other US states put together.
Really?
How do we think about the asymmetries within America and what that's going to do to the United States? How is America going to reindustrialize, which in my opinion it needs to do, if it's going to be able to deter a war, a potentially catastrophic war with China? Because I think unless America reindustrializes, it is not going to be able to win a protracted war against China, probably. And therefore, if the Chinese realize that, then it will be more difficult for the Americans to deter such a war. So I think reindustrialization, which I know is deeply unpopular in lots of quarters, I think is going to be absolutely crucial for the United States. So I think there are huge challenges. So that's kind of my next project, is thinking about this world of change that you both so nicely described, which really is changing now, as opposed to all of the world of change that we've had for the last 40 years, where actually it was quite evolutionary. I think now we're in a period of revolutionary transformation.
This has been so educational, and we both really appreciate your time, your insights, your research. Thank you for the book. I love the book. I recommend everybody get a copy. And thank you. Good luck on your next endeavors.
And the mindset economy has really benefited from your time, and I hope everybody watching, listening into this does take time to read your book and at least think about some of the big questions that you posed in here. They're incredibly powerful. Thank you.
And hopefully it will help you with everyday life as well.
Exactly.
It will.
Grounding from the big to the everyday help.
That's what's so great about it. It does go from the big questions down to everyday life. So
I agree.
Thank you so much.
Wow, every time I talk to Nick, I feel like my mental model is getting a significant upgrade.
Yeah, this conversation really highlights why the mindset economy isn't just our attempt at some catchy phrase or title for a show. When the world enters a revolutionary phase of change, like the one that we're currently in, our ability to learn and adapt and update our thinking will profoundly influence our economic success, our well-being, and our capacity to brace uncertainty.
If you want to get a deeper dive into his work and his ideas, then definitely pick up a copy of Warhead. It's a phenomenal read, and it bridges the gap between brain science and how human behavior is playing out in global strategy. It's really worth it.
Absolutely, John. So, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you hit that follow button so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Rate the show, leave us a review, and tell us, are you actively updating your mental models? If you're here, it means you're willing to. So, be sure to join us next time as we continue to explore the mindset economy.